Today, right now, as this video goes live, something is happening on the streets of America that has never happened before in the entire history of the United States. Millions of people in over 3,000 cities, towns, and communities across all 50 states, and in cities around the world, in Mexico, in Canada, in Europe, in Asia, all of them carrying the same message, all of them saying the same two words: no kings. The largest single day of political protest in American history is happening today. Not in the history of the Trump era, not in the history of the past decade, in the entire recorded history of the United States of America. A country that was born in revolution, that marched for civil rights, that protested Vietnam, that gathered after September the 11th, has never seen a single day of protest at the scale of what is unfolding right now on March the 28th, 2026. And Donald Trump called it a disgrace. This is Geo Polity, and this is episode 9 of the 2026 World Crisis Series, the episode where the story stops being about what governments are doing to the world and becomes about what the people of the most powerful country on earth are doing in response. Welcome back to Geo Polity. If you have been with us through all 8 previous episodes, you have watched us build the most comprehensive picture of 2026's cascading crises that exists anywhere on YouTube. Oil and Iran, China and Taiwan, Trump and the Supreme Court, Israel and Lebanon, Putin and Ukraine, Delta Force and Venezuela, Kharg Island and the oil apocalypse, the Iran ceasefire deadline, and the 10 days that will determine whether the global economy survives intact. Today's episode is different, because today the story is not happening in Tehran or Beirut or Caracas or the Persian Gulf. It is happening on the streets of Minneapolis and Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. It is happening in the communities and the hearts of ordinary American citizens who have decided that watching and waiting is no longer enough. If you are new here, subscribe now and watch the full series, because understanding why these protests are happening, really understanding it, requires everything we have covered in the 8 episodes that came before this one. Let us start with the numbers, because the scale of what is happening today is the first thing that needs to be understood clearly. All signs point to March 28th potentially being the single largest day of domestic political protest in American history. Trump has the highest disapproval rating of any president at this point in his presidency in this century. LBC. To put that in historical context, the Women's March of January 2017, the day after Trump's first inauguration, drew an estimated 3 to 4 million people and was at the time called the largest single-day protest in American history. The first major No Kings action on June 14, 2025, drew 5 million people. October 18, 2025, saw participation grow to 7 million across 2,700 events. The movement has drawn over 12 million cumulative participants to date. Bloomberg Today's organizers are predicting that March the 28th will surpass all of those numbers. More than 3,000 events are planned in cities across the United States, with several more planned abroad, including in Mexico and Canada. Yahoo! 3,000 events in a single day. In a country that has been through 4 weeks of war, rising gas prices, a partial government shutdown, airport security chaos, constitutional battles over tariffs, and a ceasefire deadline that now sits just 9 days away. This is not a protest. This is a verdict. Now, let us talk about what is actually driving people into the streets today. Because the No Kings movement did not appear from nowhere, it is the accumulated weight of everything this channel has been documenting for 9 weeks and more, landing on the consciousness of ordinary American citizens and producing an eruption of civic energy that the country has never seen before. The war in Iran is central to why today's protests are larger than any that came before. Demonstrators say they are concerned about the human and financial costs of war overseas, while Americans struggle at home. Global Witness. 4 weeks of conflict. Oil prices at $100 a barrel. Gas prices rising every week. A Pentagon request for $200 billion more on top of an already enormous defense budget. And a ceasefire deadline that has been extended twice, from March the 23rd to March the 27th to now April the 6th, while the bombs keep falling and the bills keep rising. American families are feeling this war in their wallets every single day, and they are not seeing a clear explanation of why it was started, what success looks like, or when it ends. Trump's war in Iran, now nearing the 1-month mark, is continuing to spark controversy even among some members of his own party, who have criticized the Trump administration for not sharing details about the military operation and pushed back against the prospects of deploying American ground troops and pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into the conflict. Yahoo! That last detail is critical. American ground troops. The Pentagon is reportedly considering a ground invasion of Iran as part of what military planners are calling the final blow. The protests happening today are partly a response to that possibility. Because American parents, American partners, American families remember Iraq. They remember Afghanistan. They remember what it looks like when a military operation that began with airstrikes expands into ground troops and then into a decade-long commitment that costs trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives and ends with nothing resembling the victory that was promised. They do not want to do it again. Beyond the war, the protests reflect the accumulated grievance of everything else that has happened in the past 14 months of Trump's second term. Immigration enforcement that has separated families and resulted in deaths in communities across America. A government shutdown that has left airport security understaffed and created hours-long queues that are making ordinary travel a nightmare. Attacks on free speech, on civil rights, on the independence of the judiciary. An executive branch that has defied the Supreme Court, bypassed Congress, and accumulated powers that the American constitutional system was specifically designed to prevent any single person from holding. Masked secret police terrorizing communities. An illegal, catastrophic war putting people in danger and driving up costs. Attacks on freedom of speech, civil rights, freedom to vote. Costs pushing families to the brink. British brief. That is the language the organizers are using, and the fact that millions of Americans are responding to that language by physically leaving their homes, traveling to protest locations, and standing in the streets for hours tells you something essential about the depth of feeling that language is touching. Now let us talk about the geography of today's protests. Because where people are protesting is as important as how many are protesting. About 66% of the planned protests will take place outside major urban centers, and nearly half of the demonstrations will take place outside cities altogether. LBC. This is not a protest of blue city elites. This is a protest of small towns and suburbs and rural communities that have historically leaned toward Trump but are now feeling the direct economic consequences of policies they supported and are beginning to question. When a family in a small town in Ohio that voted for Trump in 2024 shows up to a No Kings protest in March 2026, that is not a political rally. That is a warning signal. It is the kind of signal that historically precedes major political realignments, the kind of signal that ends presidencies and reshapes congressional majorities. The most striking shift researchers have found has been in the gender of the protesters. In January of 2025, 77% of the People's March were women. In October's No Kings events, that number fell to 57%. Yahoo men are now marching in numbers that were not present in the early resistance to Trump's second term. Older voters who remember previous wars are marching alongside younger people who have never known a world without social media and algorithmic news. Veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and who look at the Iran war and see the same pattern of justifications and the same absence of a credible exit strategy are marching. This is not a coalition. This is a convergence. And convergences of this scale in American political history have consequences that are felt for years. The flagship event of the day is in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. Performers and speakers in St. Paul will include Senator Bernie Sanders, Bruce Springsteen, Jane Fonda, and Joan Baez. These are not fringe figures. Bruce Springsteen is perhaps the most iconic living American rock musician. His presence at a political protest of this scale is a cultural statement as much as a political one. His music, rooted in working-class American life, in the dignity of labor, in the promise and the betrayal of the American dream, is the soundtrack to exactly the kind of anxiety and anger that is driving people into the streets today. In New York City, marches are converging from multiple boroughs towards central Manhattan. In Chicago, tens of thousands are expected in Grant Park, the same park where in 1968, police clashed violently with protesters against the Vietnam War in scenes that shocked the world and helped define a generation. In Washington, D.C., marchers are heading toward the White House itself. In Los Angeles, in Atlanta, in Phoenix, in Dallas, in cities that have not historically been centers of mass protest, the streets are filling. And around the world, in an echo of the global women's marches that followed Trump's first inauguration, protests are taking place in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Toronto, in Mexico City, in Sydney. Because the decisions being made in Washington are not felt only in America. Every barrel of oil that costs $100 instead of $60 is felt in every country on Earth. Every trade war tariff ripples through every supply chain on every continent. Every military operation in the Persian Gulf affects shipping, energy, and food prices everywhere. The world is watching America. And part of what the world is watching is whether American democracy has the resilience to hold its own government accountable through the mechanisms it was built to provide. Now, let us talk about Trump's response, because how a president responds to the largest protest in his country's history tells you something important about how he understands his relationship to the people he was elected to serve. Trump has previously dismissed the No Kings protests as the work of political operatives and paid agitators. He told Fox News in a previous interview, "They are referring to me as a king. I am not a king." That response, simultaneously minimizing the protests and defending himself against the accusation they represent, tells you something about the political sensitivity of the king framing. Because the genius of the No Kings movement, from an organizational standpoint, is that it has attached itself to something foundational in American identity. The United States was created specifically in opposition to monarchy. The founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, are animated by an explicit rejection of the idea that any person should hold unchecked power over others. When ordinary Americans look at an executive branch that is defying courts, bypassing Congress, starting wars without authorization, conducting regime change operations in foreign countries, and building a system of enforcement that operates outside normal legal constraints, the king framing lands. It lands not because it is partisan. It lands because it is constitutional. And constitutional arguments in America are the most powerful arguments of all. Now let us connect today's protests to the broader story of 2026 that this channel has been documenting. Because these events are not separate from the geopolitical crises we have covered, they are the domestic consequence of those crises arriving home. The Iran war drove oil prices to $100 a barrel. Those prices are being felt at gas stations across America every single day. Families who supported the war in its first week, when it felt like strength and decisive action, are now watching their gas bills climb for the fourth consecutive week with no end in sight. The gap between the confidence of the declaration, "This war will be over very soon," and the reality of the ongoing costs is producing exactly the kind of buyer's remorse that drives political mobilization. The tariff crisis that we covered in Episode 3, Trump defying his own Supreme Court, households paying over $1,000 in tariffs ruled to be illegal, is part of the same economic squeeze that is pushing people into the streets today. When your gas costs more, your groceries cost more, your energy bill is higher, and your government just asked Congress for $200 billion more for a war and told you it was your patriotic duty to pay for it, the capacity for patience runs out. The Venezuela operation that we covered in Episode 6, Delta Force, the blindfolded dictator, the announcement that America would run the country and take the oil, struck many Americans not as a triumph, but as a preview. A preview of an executive branch that believes it can do anything it wants, anywhere it wants, with no legal constraint and no accountability. If it can happen in Venezuela, what else can happen? Where else? And who decides? These questions are not abstract for the people marching today. They are the questions that woke them up this morning and got them out of the house and into the street. Let us now talk about what today means politically. Because beyond the immediate spectacle of millions of people marching, the No Kings protests have a strategic logic that is worth examining clearly. The organizers of the No Kings movement, primarily the group Indivisible and its coalition partners, are explicitly oriented toward the 2026 midterm elections. Those elections, scheduled for November, will determine whether Trump's Republican Party retains its majorities in the House and Senate. If it does, the final 2 years of Trump's second term will face minimal congressional check. If it does not, if Democrats retake one or both chambers, the legislative and oversight landscape changes dramatically. Every person who comes out to a No Kings protest today is a potential voter in November. Every person who comes out today and then goes home and joins a local organizing group, makes phone calls, registers neighbors to vote, or runs for local office is a force multiplier for the electoral consequences that these protests are designed to produce. The organizers understand that protests alone do not change governments. What changes governments is the transformation of protest energy into electoral energy. And the infrastructure being built around the No Kings movement, the local groups, the training sessions, the digital networks, the relationships between strangers who discover they share the same fears and the same hopes, is exactly the infrastructure that electoral campaigns are built from. Trump's political team understands this too, which is why his response to the protests has consistently tried to delegitimize them, painting them as foreign-funded, professionally organized, and unrepresentative of real American opinion, rather than engage with the substance of the objections being raised. Because engaging with the substance would require acknowledging that the objections are valid. They are valid. Rising gas prices are valid. $200 billion war budgets are valid. Airport chaos from a government shutdown is valid. GK challenges to executive overreach are valid. These are not the grievances of professional protesters. They are the experiences of ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives in a country that is being governed in ways that make ordinary life more difficult and more expensive every week. Now let us zoom out GK picture, because what is happening in America today is being GK the crises we have been documenting all year. In Tehran, Iranian negotiators watching the largest protest in American history are drawing their own conclusions. GK facing domestic political pressure of this scale, the highest disapproval rating of the century at this point in a presidency, millions in the street K, members of his own party breaking ranks over the war, is a president whose capacity to sustain a pre-gay campaign is not unlimited. Iranian strategy has always incorporated the assumption that American public opinion is a constraint on American military power. What they are seeing today reinforces that assumption. In Beijing, Xi Jinping's analysts are watching the protests and updating their models of American political stability. A democracy in which the executive is simultaneously at war abroad, in constitutional confrontation with its own judiciary, engaged in a trade war with its allies, and facing the largest domestic protest movement in its history, is a democracy under stress. That stress affects American strategic capacity. It affects alliance management. It affects the credibility of American security commitments from Taiwan to Europe. In Moscow, Putin is watching. He has always argued that Western liberal democracy is internally contradictory and ultimately unstable. Today's images, millions of Americans in the streets against their own government, will be used in Russian state media as evidence for exactly that argument. Whether that argument is valid is a separate question. The propaganda value of today's protests for Kremlin narratives about American decline is enormous and will be exploited thoroughly. In London, in Paris, in Berlin, European governments are watching with a mixture of solidarity and alarm. Solidarity with the values the protesters represent: democratic accountability, constitutional government, the rule of law. Alarm because the stability of American leadership is the foundation on which European security has been built for 80 years. A destabilized America, regardless of which political direction the destabilization comes from, is a less reliable guarantor of the European security architecture that was built after the Second World War and that faces its greatest stress test since the Cold War. So what happens next? Where does the energy of today go? In the short term, the protests end and people go home. That is always what happens. The march finishes, the speeches conclude, the crowd disperses. And the question that matters, the question that determines whether today is a historical footnote or a historical turning point, is what people do in the days and weeks and months after they go home. The organizers of No Kings have a clear answer to that question. They are building local groups in communities across the country. They are training people in electoral organizing. They are running candidate recruitment programs for local offices, school boards, city councils, state legislatures, because they understand that power in America is built from the ground up, not handed down from a national movement. They are planning the next day of action. They are constructing the infrastructure for a sustained political movement rather than a single spectacular event. Whether that infrastructure produces the electoral results in November that they are aiming for is a question that only time and the American electorate can answer. What is certain is that the energy being expressed in the streets today is real. It is broad. It is diverse in a way that previous resistance movements were not. And it is connected to the specific, concrete, daily life consequences of specific, concrete government decisions in a way that makes it durable. People do not stay angry in the abstract for long. But people stay angry about gas prices. They stay angry about government shutdowns that made them stand in a security line for 4 hours. They stay angry about a war they were not asked about and did not vote for and are paying for with both money and anxiety. That specific, concrete, cost-of-living anger is the fuel that keeps political movements alive between the big days and through the long months of ordinary time. And that is ultimately what today means. Not just the spectacle of millions in the streets, not just the historical record of the largest protest in American history, but the signal it sends about what is building underneath the surface of American political life. A signal that the costs of the decisions documented in 8 previous episodes of this channel, the oil war, the China risk, the tariff crisis, the Lebanon invasion, the Ukraine abandonment, the Venezuela operation, the Kharg Island bombing, and the ceasefire deadline, are accumulating in the lives of ordinary American citizens in ways that are producing consequences that no government can simply dismiss or deflect indefinitely. Power in a democracy ultimately flows from the people. Today, the people are in the streets, and the world is watching. If this episode added something to your understanding of what is happening in America and why it matters globally, please like this video right now. 9 episodes in, your engagement is what keeps this analysis reaching the people who need it most. Subscribe to Geo Polity if you are not already here. April the 6th is 9 days away. The Iran ceasefire deadline is coming. Episode 10 is already forming, and the story is moving faster than it ever has. Share this video with someone who saw images of today's protests and wanted to understand what is really driving them. Not the partisan framing, not the political spin. The real, connected, evidence-based explanation of why millions of people decided today was the day they could no longer stay home. And leave a comment. Tell us, are you inspired by what is happening today or alarmed by it? Do you think protests of this scale will actually change anything? And where in the world are you watching from? Because this is a global story, not just an American one. We read everything, every comment, and your answers shape episode 10. This is Geo Polity. Stay informed, stay analytical, and we will see you in the next one.